Chapter 13 Fire Time, in which Max lives well, then not so well, encounters 3 knights and a witch, and receives a gift beyond price. Max Piper stayed in his cozy cottage for several months, clear through the harsh winter, eating his fill every day and keeping warm by the crackling fire. Having gone hungry for an extended period of time, exposed all the while to the bitter elements, warmth, comfort, and enough to eat became the sum total of Max's ambitions. It's entirely possible that he'd never have wanted to leave, if not for the deceit and low actions of Mr. and Mrs. Skip, the cottage's previous owners. At first, Max had planned to simply kill anyone living in the home, going so far as to unsheathe Frost-Taker for instant action as he pounded boldly on the cottage's single door. But when the door finally opened, he saw that a timid old fat man and his old fat wife were the dwelling's sole occupants. He reconsidered the need for murder. Neither looked as if they could possibly offer him any harm. Better to question them first, at least long enough to find out how far away the nearest neighbors might be, and what dangers might lurk in this neck of the woods. "Who are you?" Max shouted into the old man's face. Not waiting for an answer, he pushed past the fellow and entered the little home's single room. "I'm Gerwolf Skep," the old man said, "and this is Claudia, my good wife." Palpable fright was evident in Gerwolf's voice. Max recognized the tone as one of instantaneous and complete surrender. He'd have no trouble with these two, assuming there were only 2 of them. "Who else lives here?" he demanded. "No one. We're all alone," Claudia said. She'd been sitting in a wing-back, densely upholstered chair by the fire. There was a bowl full of potatoes in a lap which she'd been peeling with a paring knife. When Max burst in, she seemed to shrink further into the chair's cushions, as though hoping to flee by disappearing into them. "Our daughter from town visits us once a week to see that we are still well," she continued. "At least she used to, but she hasn't come in 3 weeks now." "She was probably killed by the invaders," Max said. "Invaders?" Gerwolf said, his wide eyes growing wider still. "We'll talk about that later," Max said. "After I'm fed and rested. I've been days alone in the woods and suddenly find myself nigh exhausted. You'll cook my dinner and then stay quiet while I sleep by the fire." "Lost in the woods?" Claudia said. "Oh dear, you poor young man." "Of course you're welcome to the hospitality of our home," Gerwolf said. My home, Max thought as he settled by the fire, but he didn't say it aloud. Better for now to let them think I might be willing to leave once I've recovered, just in case they conjure enough courage to try slitting my throat while I sleep. After that long night, once Max had wakened to find his throat uncut and the Schweppes still cowed and deferential, he had described to them in no uncertain terms the new pattern their 3 lives would take from that day forward. From now on, Max was master of the house, and the Schweppes would be his servants. Claudia would cook his meals, wash and mend his clothes, draw his bards, and generally keep the house. Gerwolf would chop the wood for his fire, butcher the livestock for his meat, and generally do everything that needed doing outside of the home. Max explained that he never wanted to venture outside again, at least until new warm days arrived with next year's spring, and expected never to have to. This worked well for a number of weeks. Max seemed content to sit by the fire all day, eating every meal there as Claudia brought them to him, and only moved when it was time to take to the cabin's only bed at night. He had no idea where his servants slept, since, at his insistence, they never retired at night until after he had, and always rose in the morning before he did. He never even stepped outside to use the outhouse, tucked almost invisibly back in the woods, but made his wastes in one of Claudia's treasured porcelain bowls. After all, it was their job to clean up after him and dispose of his messes. The Schweppes settled into their new life without a complaint, and Max seldom had to correct them. "You two are eating too much," he said one day, when the first snowfall of the year had begun to drift down from a dark sky. "Excuse me, Mr. Piper," Gerwolf said. "We're nearly finished with the first pig you've butchered," Max said. "And there are only 2 pigs left, plus the cow. But once we kill that for its meat, we'll never have enough to last us through the winter. Now, as the master of this house, I can hardly be expected to do with less, but you and your wife aren't eating as lowly servants should. You're feasting every day as if this is your food, and not the bounty I've generously provided for you." "But, Mr. Piper—" "Don't try to plead with me. You're both too fat anyway. Fat servants are an indictment against their lord. It shows others that he's not truly in command of his own household, that he lets even the lowest minion get away with stealing from him. Eat less, or I might be tempted to cut by 1 the number of mouths I have to feed. The 2 of you are barely doing a single man's work anyway. I'm too soft and indulge you too much." From that day on, Gerwolf and Claudia were only allowed a single meagre bowl of porridge in the morning and another at night. For the afternoon meal, Max allowed them a small serving of bread, cheese, and meat. When Max reckoned later that this new plan would ensure a surplus by winter's end, he decided to increase his own portions so as not to risk wasting any of it. 3 times a day, every day, he tucked in with gusto, but remained rail-thin. The days accumulated along with the snow. Winter set in with grim intent. Then one afternoon, when the snow had drifted high and the days had grown short, Max realized he hadn't seen Gerwolf all day. "Where is he?" Max asked of Claudia, who looked nervous and flighty, like a quivering young fawn ready to bolt at any provocation. "There are many chores to be done outside," she said. "Always? But he usually comes in 3 or 4 times a day to get warm. Has he suddenly discovered a reservoir of endurance and a sense of duty he never had before?" "We're low on firewood," she said, "and I saw him earlier with the axe. Perhaps he's wandered afar in search of the right trees to fell. The deep snow makes for slow going." This was a perfectly reasonable explanation, as Max had not the slightest idea what the true state of their wood supply was, seeing as how it was stored outside, under the same low shed that housed the animals in winter. But something seemed false in the way Claudia acted. "You look nervous, Claudia, dear. What are you not telling me?" "Nothing at all, sir, only—" "Yes?" "Well, like you, I'm naturally nervous, because it has been some hours since Mr. Schweppes been gone. Though he's made his life as a woodcutter, he's not as young or strong as he was, and there are fell creatures in the woods." "You're offering up a number of good reasons why poor old Gerwolf might be tardy," Max said. "But now I wonder if you might be providing too many." "Never, sir." "Just the same, your worry has now become mine. I think I'd best go out and see if some harm has befallen the man." "But, sir, you never go out." "And I shouldn't have to. But like you, Claudia, dear old Gerwolf is under my care, and a good shepherd doesn't neglect his flock. Besides, at least once before the season passes, I should try out the new coat you've sewn for me over the past 2 months. After Claudia had finished cleaning and mending Max's performance suit of bright colors, seeing how deft she was with the needle and thread, Max asked about the possibility of a coat to match. Claudia practically leapt at the idea, thinking that a warm coat might inspire him to once again venture outdoors, and doing that might inspire him to move down the road to oppress other homesteads. Claudia only had bits and pieces of cloth to work with, the scraps of a lifetime of sewing not only her own clothes, but finer dresses to sell at market each year. That suited Max's tastes just fine. A coat of diverse colors and patterns would be a delight. So Claudia made Max a pied coat of bright yellows and cheerful blue stripes and silky vermilions and a dozen shades of verdant. They were bold reds offset by somber browns and amber checkerboards. Fine needlework designs tied it all together in a festive theme. It was a coat like no other, and Max loved it. Then, in order to further encourage Max to leave, she sewed him a warm liner for his coat that could be buttoned in or removed at need. In his younger days, Gerwolf had been a hunter as well as a woodcutter. He'd provided Claudia with many a fur pelt from which to devise expensive winter coats for rich townsfolk. Claudia used the many leftover scraps of treated pelts to form the liner, sewing them together any which way. She didn't worry about matching one type of fur to another, since Max revelled in the chaotic jumble of different shades and napes. Joined with the outer coat, it was a mantle that could keep a man warm on the coldest day. Claudia made it all to encourage Max to leave, but now she acted as if that was the last thing she wished him to do. "Don't worry, old mother. I'll bring Gerwolf back sound and safe." Claudia couldn't answer. Max put on his coat with its fur liner, a pair of the couple's old fur snow boots, which turned out to fit his feet just fine, and then buckled his sword belt outside the coat. After he left, walking resolutely through the drifts, she tried to keep from weeping, but ultimately failed. Maybe husband left in time and is too far ahead to be caught now, she thought. And maybe Max will give up and turn back around, which, considering his past inclinations, seemed entirely likely. Outside of the cottage, Max was nearly stunned by the intensity of the cold. His first instinct was to turn around immediately and go back in. But then he saw the tracks Gerwolf had left from earlier in the morning. It had snowed all night and not since then, so there was only a single set of tracks leading away from the cottage, and they were as clear as could be. When he'd left early this morning, long before Max had awakened, Gerwolf had made straight for the forest path and then down it. There was no indication that he'd wander the yard at all first, as someone setting out to do the day's chores might do. The tracks never diverted close to the trees lining either side of the forest path, as someone looking for wood to chop would need to do. It was instantly evident that Gerwolf was attempting to escape, no doubt off to seek armed men to bring back for a daring rescue of his tired old wife. Max's long dormant rage ignited and grew into a strong and steady fire all in a single moment. Max, the deadly forest predator, was suddenly alive again and spoiling for the hunt. Without pausing for any further consideration, he set out at a run, following in Gerwolf's tracks. Despite the snow's impediment, he made good time. Small, fat Gerwolf didn't have Max's long and lanky strides, and he'd had to cut a new trail through the fresh snow, which had accumulated belly-high in the relatively cleared area of the forest pathway. Max only had to follow in the trail the fat old man had already cut deep for him. He ran and then rested and then ran again, surprised to discover that he was enjoying himself. In fact, he was having fun. Now that he'd adjusted to being outdoors for the first time in months, he was perfectly warm in his long pied coat. Max ran and ran as the weary sun dropped closer and closer to the horizon. Even in the dead of winter, the sun's setting was gradual enough that Max was surprised when he realized it had actually turned dark. He chased Gerwolf for hours, but now it was time to turn back. He'd learned his lesson months ago that attempting to navigate the woods at night was a fool's endeavor. Then again, this was an odd sort of dark, for though the woods were black indeed, as was the sky overhead, the trail through the woods was still plain to see, draped as it was with a vast blanket of pure white snow. Even at night, The white snow stood out brightly in stark contrast to the woods. He could continue on and still find his way back home without fear of losing his way. And then, while Max was still dithering, trying to decide which way to go, he spotted a faint flicker of yellow light in the distance, like a single candle flame as seen from across a large hall. "That's a fire," he said aloud. So Max trudged forward, and in little time at all he came up onto a humble campsite, pitched just off the side of the trail. Gerwolf was seated alone in the camp, close to the fire he'd built, but still shivering in his winter coat. He saw Max walk up on him, but made no attempt to flee or grab for his axe, which was set into the same fallen log he was using for his seat. "I thought you'd never try to follow me," he said. "I almost didn't," Max said. Frost-Taker rose slithering from its sheath, thirsty and eager, hardly helped at all by Max's guiding hand. "4 more miles and I would have made it," Gerwolf said, "but I got too tired to continue tonight." "Bad luck, then," Max said. Frost-Taker struck. Then it reared back and struck again and again. It was all Max could do to hold on to it. Claudia didn't last long after that night. She didn't need to be told a thing when Max returned to the cottage early in the following morning. His grim face told the story entire. She tried to carry on and keep working, hoping that a daughter would arrive some day with a company of hard men to put things right. But the life had simply drained out of her with Gerwolf's loss. It was as if she had been stricken with the same thrusts of Frost-Taker's blade that had killed her husband. Within 2 weeks, she passed away in the night, leaving Max entirely on his own once again. Max deeply resented the betrayal. "I protected them and cared for them," he grumbled to the walls, "and they paid me back by abandoning me, just like father and mother did, and so did filthy Peter and all of the peeps. They all ran off and left me in the woods to die like an animal." After Claudia died, after he dragged a body to the edge of the woods and left it there, food for whatever sort of thing that might happen to come along and take it, Max had to fend for himself. He wasn't very good at it. He couldn't figure out how to coax smoke from the cow, and finally decided just to butcher it for the meat. But the cow didn't cooperate at all, finally running off down the snowy path, bleeding from a dozen minor cuts, and lowering angry insults into the cold air. After killing 4 chickens, cutting them into useless jumbles of blood, gore, and feathers, he finally managed to get one more or less intact onto a roasting spit. He did better with the pigs, having learned his lesson from the mess he made with the cow. He reached in and cut its throat first, before trying to cut or stab the animal anywhere else. Then he could chop at the dead pig all he liked, hacking off ragged chunks of meat as he needed them. But then, on the 6th day in a row that he trudged outside to cut his daily chunk of pork shoulder off the nearly frozen pig, he discovered that some beast had come in the night and dragged the remainder of its carcass away. "That's not fair!" Max shouted up to the indifferent sky. "There was so much left!" As the early spring rains came to start washing the snow away, Max killed the last pig, and this time he cut every bit of meat he could get off it all at once, taking all day and half the night to complete the bloody work. Then he hauled all of the meat inside the cabin, where it would be safe from predators in the night. It took him several trips to tote every piece inside, and he piled it on the table and counter and on the top of the sideboard after he'd cleared all of Claudia's fancy serving dishes off it. Within a month, the cottage smelled like a charnel house, and Max was sick in his belly from rotted pork. Aching and half delirious, he tossed the remainder of the rotting pig meat out of the front door, hurling each piece as far from the door as he could. Then he took to his bed and stayed there for 8 days, writhing in a deep fever, until it finally broke and he fell well enough to get up. The next day he trudged out to the animal shed again, empty now, except for the chickens and a few remaining sticks of firewood. "Gerwolf lied about the fire or two," Max said, perhaps talking to the chickens, perhaps not. "There was plenty. Didn't he realize that that would be the first thing I'd check?" Max chose to ignore the fact that he hadn't actually checked. Then, with nothing more to say about the wood, Max gathered the eggs which had accumulated over the past 8 days and brought them back into the cottage, where he boiled them all in Claudia's biggest copper pot. While the eggs boiled, he gathered up the remaining potatoes, carrots, onions, oats, sugar, salt, yellow cheese, and other sundries, and dumped them all into a single burlap sack. He didn't take the flour because he had no idea how to turn it into bread, or pie crusts, or any of the 1,000 other wonderful things traitorous old Claudia was able to do with it. When the eggs were boiled, he added those too to the sack. Then he filled the pockets of his coat with plenty of flint and tinder for starting fires, after which he was more or less ready to be on his way. He donned his warm coat of diverse colors, to which a goodly amount of pig's blood had recently been added, buckled on his sword belt, took up the sack of victuals. Then he stepped out the front door for the last time. Patches of snow were still nestled into the crooks and crannies of the earth. The air was filled with the sounds of 10,000 trickles of water, melting off the remaining snow, running downhill, where it accumulated into the forest path, which acted as a makeshift drainage ditch, turning its ground into a soup of slick rocks and mud. "Better than struggling through the forest, though," Max said. Then, once again, picking his direction at random, he set off down the wet path, leaving the ruined little cottage in the deep woods forever. Early in the spring of the new year, a dark and lovely young woman of the ancient craft walked down a wide forest road, in the company of a coal-black goat with high twisty horns and eyes of red fire. She wore a dress of fine linen, dyed carnelian. Golden needlework in the pattern of leaves and twining thorn branches decorated its collar, sleeves, and hem. A girdle of woven hemp enclosed her waist. From her belt dangled 2 daggers in bejeweled sheaths, one curved and the other straight. Also hanging from her belt was a small leather pouch of casting stones, with many an occult symbol inscribed on them. Her hair was long, black, and silken. Her skin was pale and unblemished. Her lips were red. She chatted with the goat as they walked together. Her feet were bare against the road's hard-packed dirt and embedded stones. The goat wore no leash or tether. Max watched the girl and her goat from the concealment of the woods. He'd wandered through the forest for days, having been scared off the previous small path by the passage of a company of goblin foot soldiers. They'd come marching single file down the same narrow path he was on, no doubt on their way to expand the extent of their conquest into the smaller side roads and remote corners of the territory. Spotting them before they spotted him, Max had scrambled into the woods just in time to avoid their notice. Now, days later, he thrashed, cursed, and stumbled his way to this much larger woodland avenue. He was about to step out onto it when he spied the girl and a companion goat walking towards him, approaching the place of his concealment. What to do about her? He wondered. The last of his boiled eggs had run out a week ago, closely followed by the remaining cheese, carrots, and potatoes, leaving him only a few overripe onions to sate his hunger. The goat might make a fine meal, he thought, and the girl, what might I do with her? Intriguing ideas began to occur to him while he hid in the underbrush. She was indeed a pretty one, he considered, and I'm now, by any honest measure, a man grown. It's well past time I began to do things with pretty girls. Max was in the process of screwing up his courage, preparing to step out into the road to block the girl's progress, when a new development interrupted his plans. The heavy sounds of approaching horses rose from behind the girl, farther down the road. Only a moment later, 3 riders appeared from around the bend. They were knights of the gentry, That much was immediately obvious. They were dressed in armor of shining plate over chainmail, and wore bright surcoats over that, decorated with complex heraldic devices on their breasts. The war horses they rode were huge and intimidating beasts, snorting and thundering. The dark girl turned to watch them as they rode up to her. She seemed unconcerned, only mildly curious, and made no move to flee or even step off the road. The riders reined up next to her. Their horses' great hooves kicked up mud in their efforts to stop, spattering the girl's white legs and the hem of her fine dress.
"Well, here's an unexpected prize on a dreary day,"
one of the knights said. He was clean-shaven and fair-haired. His device was 2 golden griffins, adorned with their wings abased.
"What's your name, girl?"
he said, unsheathing his most dazzling smile. "I have many names," she said, "and I change them often, lest I begin to think of myself by one of them more than another. Then one of my rivals might learn of it and use it to conjure against me."
"Many names is fine,"
a second knight said,
"as long as I can steal a lusty kiss from each one."
That earned a laugh from the first knight, but the girl and the third knight remained silent and unimpressed by the jape. The third knight wore a deep scowl.
"We're wasting time here,"
the third knight snarled.
"I want to be under good cover before the rains come again."
He had dark hair and a dark beard that was cut into a single point that jutted from his chin like a dagger. His armor was enameled in a midnight blue, and his device was a red falcon at prey against a field of vert.
"You, girl, we're on our way to Hamlin town to reinforce the imperial garrison."
"To greatly improve it," the second knight interrupted. He had long and curly brown hair, but a darker beard and moustaches. His device was a purple vine against a barry of 12 in argent and azure.
"Tell us if we're on the right road, and how far away it is,"
the third knight continued. "You're on the right road," the girl said, "and going in the proper direction. You'll reach Hamlin before nightfall if you continue to ride with a purpose, but I can't say if you'll get there before the rain resumes."
"I can,"
the goat said, startling all but the girl. Even Max, in his hiding place, was surprised.
"The rain will certainly catch you before you reach your destination. You'll arrive drenched to your new duty station."
"Blood of the gods!" the second knight said. "I can't abide animals that pretend to a man's speech." He dismounted, tossing the reins of his charger to the knight with the griffins on his chest. "I'd thought of making my dinner out of this beast, but a talking one is unnatural. I won't have it." He drew his long sword. "Stop!" the girl cried. "How dare you!" But it was too late. The knight of the vine struck once and then twice. With the second blow, the goat's head was separated entire from its body. Both parts splashed into a brown puddle on the muddy road. There was surprisingly little blood, but a dark and grainy mist seemed to rise from the carcass for just a moment before fading into the afternoon's breeze.
"Nicely done, Sir Deirdrick,"
the griffin's knight said.
"But I venture I could have done as much with a single cut."
"No," the girl said, "that wasn't nicely done at all. It's a fearsome power you've released back into the wild world this day. It took me 12 lifetimes to bind it safely into so gentle a form. I'll have recompense from you 3. "The only payment I'll award you," the Knight of the Vine said, "is a little bastard to round out your flat belly." The girl said nothing to this, but backed away from the dismounted knight, placing a hand on the hilt of one of her daggers.
"It's not your place to demand anything from sworn officers of the Empire,"
the scowling falcon knight said.
"You should take care, girl, lest we take you to trial as an unauthorized witch. You already admitted as much."
"The trouble with witch trials," she said, is that once in a great while you actually capture a real one. And then the spectacle never turns out the way you anticipate. Often the one who ends up hanged, or drowned, or burned isn't the one in the docket. The girl and the Falcon Knight glared at each other for a long moment. A few small raindrops pattered against armor and mud, advanced skirmishers for the vast army to come. "Mount your horse, Sir Deirdrick," the Falcon Knight said, breaking the brief contest of wills. "I told you we are wasting our time here." The Vine's Knight slowly, and some might say insolently, cleaned his blade on the goat's black coat. Then he sheathed it, took the reins back from his fellow knight, and mounted. He smiled one last smile at the dark girl and blew her a kiss, before the company spurred their horses and rode off along the forest road. Max stayed in his hiding place, determined to remain quiet as a mouse. Any thoughts he'd entertained about confronting this dark girl had fled. His new plan was to wait where he was until, like the three imposing knights, she too had continued on her way. The girl stood over the goat's black carcass for a long time as the rain gradually grew more insistent. Then once again she said, "There will be recompense," as if making a promise to the dead animal. After a while she resumed her way, apparently not minding the rain, which had begun falling in earnest by then. When she was directly across from Max's hiding place in the underbrush, just inside the tree line, she paused in the middle of the road and looked in Max's direction, as if she could see him, or at least knew he was there. In his hiding place, Max was frozen in fright. Though he was certain of his concealment, she was looking directly at him. What should I do? He frantically wondered. Then, never having spoken to him, the girl turned away and continued down the road. Soon enough, she disappeared around a bend. Max stayed in place for many long minutes afterward, hardly daring to make a sound and trying to understand what he'd witnessed. After a time, getting wetter all the while, he recalled his original desire to help himself to some of the goat's meat for his dinner. "The animal's of no use to anyone but me," he reasoned, "so I might as well cut myself a roast. It's newly dead, so there's no chance it will be rotted like the last meat I had the misfortune to eat. And I'd best build my evening's fire soon, before there's no wood dry enough to light." Timid as a deer, ready to spring away at any provocation, Max ventured out into the road. He walked a few paces up its length to the goat's carcass, where he used his sword to hack and chop at it. In little time he'd cut himself several strips of meat. He brought the smallest one up to his lips to taste at it, never having tried goat before. He nearly gagged. "This wretched thing's flesh tastes of ashes and dust," he said aloud. He dropped the slice of goat's meat and looked all around him accusingly, though there was no longer anyone there to complain to. Out in the middle of the road he was getting wetter under the more direct rainfall. He needed to be on his way. But first he needed to pick a direction in which to continue his wandering. He considered something the knights had said. They were on their way to Hamlin Town, and now Max remembered that he'd once undertaken a journey to the same place. That was where his family and the Peep family had agreed to rendezvous, should they become separated in the Black Forest. More important, if Peter was still alive, that's where he'd most certainly be. Frosttaker practically hummed at its sheet. "Peter has my inheritance," Max said. "The dirty thief stole it from me and thinks he got away clean with it. Time to set things right." Frosttaker silently agreed. "I can easily avoid any number of soldiers and silly little girls along the way, and Hamlin will certainly welcome someone like me, a fierce warrior and a hunter of men." He thought of the warm beds and cooked meals that are always available in towns. So, like the three knights and the dark girl before him, Max set off in the direction of Hamlin. An hour later, Max was drenched and miserable again. The cold rain had steadily increased in intensity until it had become a downpour. The day had turned dark, either with the coming of night or by the heavy rain shroud, or both combined. He thought about seeking shelter until the worst of the rain had passed, and there, like an answer to his wish, he spied a house in the distance. This was a cottage even smaller than the Schweppes' humble home. My former home, he corrected himself. Its 4 walls were made of wood planks on top of piled stones. Its roof was made of straw, and it had a stone chimney. Its single door was made of stout boards, and there was the face of a lion carved in it, with its jaws wide open. A wind chime dangled from one of the eaves, with the shapes of stars and crescent moons carved out of copper. Against one wall there were set many clay and porcelain jars, of all different sizes. Some had lids fastened down on them, with wax sealing the rims, while others were left open and were now collecting rain. One jar had a picture of an ancient warship engaged in a fierce battle depicted on it. Many seashells were tacked up on the wall above the jars, arrayed in a complex pattern of shapes and colors. Indecipherable runes had been inscribed all around them in white paint against the wall's natural brown. To one side of the cottage, large rounded stones, each one draped in a cloak of deep green moss, were set out to enclose a rectangle of yard, which was filled with smaller pearl-white pebbles. There was the skeleton of a great beast lying in this enclosure. Max couldn't tell what sort of creature it had been, but in life it would have been large enough to swallow Max whole, without the need of any of the many long fangs in its jaws. 100 tiny green lizards sat on Ribbon's skull or scampered along the other parts, making their home among the bones. Welcoming light shone from the cottage's one visible window, which had real glazing fitted into its frames. A fat toad of many colors sat on a stump outside of the door and watched Max as he approached. "Croak," the toad said. Max ignored it.
"Dinner's almost ready,"
the toad said next, which Max couldn't ignore. All of a sudden, Max realized where he was. This must be the strange girl's house, and he turned away from the cottage, determined to be on his way again despite the cold and rain. But before he'd made more than a few steps, the lion-faced door opened to reveal the dark girl standing in the threshold, silhouetted by warm and inviting yellow light. "I was beginning to worry you hadn't received my invitation," she said to Max's retreating back. "Huh?" Max said, turning to face her. "Won't you come out of the rain?" she said, stepping to one side to wave him in. "Fafnir was right. Your supper's almost done." "My supper?" "Yes." "For me?" "Exactly so, though I hazard there might be enough for me as well." Max stood in the wet yard, staring at her, mouth agape. "If you can't conclude whether or not you're hungry, you might as well debate the matter in here, where you can at least get warm and dry while you decide." After another moment, Max shrugged and entered the cottage. "Welcome to my home, Max," she said as he passed over a hearth. "How do you know my name?" He stopped again, ready to bolt away. "A simple working. You don't change your name often enough to hide it from one such as I." Dinner consisted of plum pudding, a mountain of green peas, and a score of plum-stuffed baby quail baked into a flaky pie. Then there were buttered new potatoes and a dripping red roast, which the truly lovely girl invited Max to carve at as often as he liked. There were brown rolls just out of the oven to dip into the gravy or sop up the meat drippings. After all of that, there were fine cakes and golden mugs of beer, which, in the years before, Max had only been allowed to try once in a great while, on special occasions. But the girl, who would never speak her true name, no matter how often Max asked, allowed him to drink as much beer as he liked. "I'm the Black Forest," she said once in reply to his oft-repeated question, but that answer only confused him all the more. "Are you married?" Max said, after taking a long draught of beer to wash down a mouthful of cake. "Never," she said. "I could marry you," he said, in a calculated, offhand manner, as though he were willing to do her a favor in return for a kindness. He reasoned that he could do a lot worse than wedding a girl this young and pretty, who was also enthusiastic about feeding him. "I'm a man grown now, and at an age when I should begin to think of such things." "And perhaps we can talk about that some day, Max, but not just yet. You've so much to do for me first." "Like what?" He began to look suspicious. "Before all else, before you even take your revenge against your younger brother for his sins against you, you will first become the instrument of my revenge against those who've so gravely insulted me today. You'll punish those 3 knights of the road, and all of their comrades in arms, and perhaps even the entire Hamlin town, which they claim to rule. That's why I summoned you here tonight." "How do you know about my brother?" "I discerned ever so much about you when I first saw you in the woods. Your hatred and desire was a beautiful fire in the rain. How could you hope to hide among mere leaves and branches with a flame that burned so brightly? And oh, Max, such a consuming will you have! By the terrible power of your will alone you've managed to imbue a dull and lifeless blade with a modest touch of real magic, even though you've no understanding or practice in the craft. You've impressed me, Max. I've never seen such a thing done before, and would have considered it impossible before today." "Frostacre will help me get my inheritance back from Peter." "Perhaps so. But consider some of the other artifacts and instruments in my home. Some of them have much greater power than a mere magic blade, the most powerful of which can still only destroy one soul at a time. There are better things here you could learn to use." Max looked again about the cluttered room. Her cottage was bigger inside than out, which had disturbed him at first, until he decided that he must not have gotten a good look at the place in the dark and pouring rain. There were many more jars inside than out. Most of these were small ones, full of all sorts of tinctures and powders, the girl had said. Max didn't know what a tincture was, but knew that things in such tiny jars are usually women's stuff, so he didn't concern himself with them. There were also uncounted weapons in the place, stacked and leaned and placed everywhere, without rhyme or reason. He saw many more daggers hanging from thongs or sitting on tables, or stuffed into bookshelves to separate one book from another, and to mark a place that she'd intended to return to again. There were swords too, most of them so much finer than Frostacre, and there were spears and slings and arrows and other things that he didn't recognize, but which she assured him were absolutely instruments of mortal intent. She also had more books and scrolls that he'd never seen. Than he'd ever seen, outside of the one time he'd been allowed inside the great stone library in old Heidelberg City, when the family piper had played there 1 year. There were 100 or more dolls, and the girl had said they were powerful conjuring devices, not meant for playthings. But Max assumed she was just embarrassed to still have them, after she was no longer quite young enough to keep such things. A fat yellow tomcat, covered in old scars and missing one eye and most of its tail, stood up from the chest of drawers it had been sleeping on. It leapt ponderously down to the floor to chase a mouse. When it suddenly moved, Max's eyes naturally followed it, and so alighted on the top of the chest and the shelves it supported. On the second shelf up, he saw a long wooden flute, which he hadn't noticed before, embedded as it was among all of the other clutter. "I can play that," he said. "The flute?" she said, following the direction of his gaze. A sly smile began to grow upon her lips. It was the sort of smile from which devils and hauntings and deadly secrets are born. Yes, that's what I do. And then, after a sullen pause, well, that's what I used to do, back when I was young, before the invaders came. Then that's what you shall do again, she said, taking him by the hand and leading him over to the old chest and its shelves. She picked up the flute and handed it to him. It was a few inches longer than Frost and made out of a deep redwood, polished to a remarkable finish. There's powerful magic locked away in this thing, she said. I've been meaning to learn to play a pipe some day, so that I could explore the uses this might be put to. I'll find its power, Max said, never taking his eyes off it. What's its name? I don't know, she said. It came to me long ago, delivered by the trembling hand of a dying prince, who claimed to be the last of a dying race. Fire, Max said. Its name is Fire. And so it was.